VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And welcome to Crosstalk here on VCY America. We have some vital news that we're going to be sharing throughout the course of the broadcast today. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a must-listen-to program, and we trust you'll stand by. We'll get to our guest in just a moment, but we have received word. We first of all alerted this to you last Friday on Crosstalk, but 90 minutes from now, the United States Senate is going to be proceeding on an executive session for up to 60 minutes of discussion and debate on the motion to invoke closure on the nomination of Andrew David Hurwitz of Arizona. He is known as the architect of Roe v. Wade, and the president has nominated him to fill a seat on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. At this very moment, Concerned Women for America is saying it is vital for you to contact your U.S. senators pertaining to this confirmation. They're going to be voting. The debate starts 90 minutes from now in the United States Senate, that is, and it's the nomination of Andrew David Hurwitz, Hurwitz. He is known as the architect of Roe v. Wade. And he is being nominated here for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. To contact your senators, you can do so right now at the switchboard 202-224-3121. That's 202-224-3121. Or for a direct number to your senator, just go to senate.gov. Well, ladies and gentlemen, next week, June 20th through the 22nd, the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, otherwise known as the Rio +20 Summit, is going to be held at the Riocentro Convention Center in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The United Nations is counting on this to be the final one to enforce Agenda 21. What are the issues and what are the implications? Here to discuss this is Tom DeWeese. He is one of the nation's leading advocates of individual liberty, free enterprise, private property rights, personal privacy, back-to-basics education, and American sovereignty and independence. He's the founder and president of the American Policy Center and editor of the DeWeese Report, a leading researcher and authority on the UN's planned Agenda 21. Tom, thanks for joining us on Crosstalk.
It's good to be with you, Jim. Thank you.
As we mentioned, next week, the United Nations is going to be holding this major conference in Rio de Janeiro, dealing with a topic that you've warned about for some time called Agenda 21. It's being called the Rio +20 Summit. What's meant by that title? What is Rio +20?
Well, the original conference, the Earth Summit in 1992, which brought Agenda 21 to the public, that's been 20 years. And so they've decided to hold a conference 20 years later to assess their successes and what they've accomplished in that period of time and decide what they have to do to finish the job to put Agenda 21 in full force around the world. And
you have said that this UN conference is counting on this one to be the final summit to enforce Agenda 21. Could you just, for the benefit of our listeners, give a brief review of what Agenda 21 is?
Well, Agenda 21 is exactly what it says, an agenda. It is a plan, a blueprint to literally transform human society so that to a top-down sort of control. A small group at the top are deciding what needs to be done, how human life should be run, all under the excuse of protecting the environment and cutting back on development, cutting back our carbon footprint, if you will. That's one of the things they're always talking about. But what this does is it moves into every facet of our lives, our economy, the kind of jobs we can have, the kind of industry we can have, if at all we can have it, the kind of houses you live in, the kind of cars you drive, how much energy costs. You're looking at now energy costs coming down a little bit, but still you're looking at $3, $4 for a gallon of gas. This all stems from these policies moving towards what they call alternative energy, the windmills and the solar panels and that sort of thing, away from coal, away from oil and things that 85-90% of our energy needs are those things, and 1% of our energy needs are covered by coal and or by windmills and solar panels. But under sustainable development, there's a huge drive to implement those and eliminate the other.
I understand that early this week, people already are arriving in Rio de Janeiro. Who is it that's going to be attending this conference?
Well, they're actually looking for about 50,000 people to be there. Imagine what that's going to do to the environment of Brazil. But this will be the world leaders. There should be 120, 130 world leaders and leaders of countries. I don't know if President Obama is going to be there or not, but certainly there will be major representation from the United States. And you'll, of course, have all the heads of UN organizations. Non-governmental organizations will be the main thing. There are thousands of these non-governmental organizations. We call them NGOs. They help write the documents and create the policy that will be put on the table for these world leaders. To them, the idea is for them to come and sign these documents or approve them in some manner as being adopted by their countries to implement them.
I'd like to read from the website of the UN Convention on Sustainable Development and then have you comment on this. They have a brief section called Objective and Themes. They're saying that the objective of the conference is to secure renewed political commitment for sustainable development, assess the progress to date and the remaining gaps in the implementation of the outcomes of the major summits on sustainable development, and address new and emerging challenges. The conference will focus on two themes: A green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication, and B, the institutional framework for sustainable development. Your thoughts on their objective and themes for this conference?
Well, these are the same objectives and themes they've had for the last 20 to 30 years. Interesting, the one on poverty. This was one of the provisions back in 2000 when the UN had this big Millennium Summit, and they created the Millennium Project. One of the main goals of the Millennium Project was announced to eradicate poverty by the year 2015. I happened to debate the head of the Millennium Project at Cambridge University back in 2006, and before we went into debate, I looked at him and I said, "You realize you don't have a prayer, don't you?" And he looked at me and said, "About what?" And I said, "Eliminating poverty by the year 2015 using redistribution of wealth." And that is their plan. And he admitted to me that they didn't have any ability to do that, but this has been one of their major objectives. One of the big problems they've run into at this Rio summit, Rio Plus 20, is they have been driving to create a global fund of $100 billion, and this fund is supposed to be paid for by the industrial nations of the world, the European nations, the United States, Japan, and what this is a massive redistribution of wealth scheme. The excuse they've been using is that it is basically these countries are paying reparations for damaging the environment with our industry, and so paying these third world countries this money. So this is the whole hoax that's going on here. That is the key to it. That's what the whole thing is about: is redistribution of wealth, a redistribution of our society, and what's happening now at Rio is that behind the scenes they've been trying to put together the final documents so that they could have this big show and these world leaders would come in and sign off on these documents, and that would be the re-energizing of our commitment to sustainable development. The problem is the European nations, the industrial nations, the United States are broke, and they don't have the money to build this $100 billion fund, and so they're balking at it, and that is driving the summit towards over the cliff, that it won't have any success because they don't care whether they've got these countries to commit to environmental issues and so forth. They care about whether they're going to put their money into this $100 billion fund.
Aren't we really talking about a worldwide socialistic plan with this?
Absolutely. There is nothing else That's what it's about. And we wouldn't give up our liberties in America when we were facing the Cold War and the Soviet Union, and they tried to make the argument that Marx was superior. We wouldn't give up our liberties then. Well, when the communism fell back at the beginning of the 1990s, all these leaders of these countries, these communist countries, and some of the organizations connected to them went into the environmental movement, and they got us to start to sacrifice our liberties with the threat of environmental Armageddon. Mm-hmm. And so that's, these chicken little scares that the world's coming to an end. It's selfish for you to want to, have your job and build your home and have your family when the earth is going to come to an end. There's nothing you can do. You can't escape. You've got, that's been the argument all this time. We're finding that science is, there is no science to it. There is no science that supports this environmental Armageddon, these scare tactics that they're using, but they continue to do it. And so, that's what we're up against here.
Tom, you brought it up. We're seeing just a whole host of countries, including our own United States, that's really on the brink of financial disaster. Japan, we understand, has been hesitating to jump on board because they can no longer afford the green agenda. Wouldn't this UN agenda for sustainable development, wouldn't this really hasten the collapse of nations collectively?
There's no question about it, no question, and that's why that people are finally starting to wake up and look at this, and of course implementing their energy policies, the wind power and the solar power and so forth, and getting rid of coal and oil would absolutely collapse our economies as well, and that is happening. Why do we have this worldwide destruction of the economy? A lot has to do with these forced green policies, and what you're finding now, Europe particularly moved much quicker to implement these green policies over the last few decades than the United States did. And, the Kyoto agreement that was back in the mid-'90s that literally was calling for industrial nations to roll back their energy use by 10 to 20-year levels. And these European nations did everything they could to try to comply to that. And they found out it was impossible. They couldn't do it. And now they're finding that in their attempts to implement it, that they have absolutely destroyed their economies in doing so. So I get reports every day from Europe and from England of how they are now just throwing these radical environmental policies out as fast as they can, trying to reclaim the use of coal energy and oil and other things, and try to rebuild their economies.
Is it any wonder, I believe it was a governor of West Virginia, a major coal state here for our nation, saying that he could not back President Obama in the upcoming election for this very reason?
Yeah, he is out to destroy the coal industry. We have a glut of available oil in this country. We probably have the largest oil reserves in the world right now. They've discovered with shale oil, almost every single state has an abundance of shale oil, and Obama's administration is doing anything they can to stop the drilling of it.
Tom DeWeese is with us today. He is founder and president of the American Policy Center. Next week, the nations of the world are gathering together at the Rio Plus 20 Summit. We'll be back in 1 minute. You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, scientist with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, some scientists claim that they are about to engineer eternal life. What do they mean by this?
Chris, biotechnology has developed so far that many now claim eternal life is near in these bodies. They don't seem to recognize that death is not just a biological problem. It's a moral penalty for our sin, and especially for Adam's sin. In the beginning, the creation was without death, but it fell when Adam rejected God's rule over him. Sin's penalty was then passed to all of Adam's dominion, and the wages of sin is death. Certainly, diseases can be cured and life can be lengthened to a degree. But as we read in Hebrews, it's appointed unto man once to die, and after that, the judgment. And that's the problem. Men don't like to come under the authority of the Creator God, who created mankind back in Genesis.
This is Chris O'Brien, Thanks for going back to Genesis.
You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America. Tom DeWeese is our guest today from the American Policy Center. We're talking about the Rio Plus 20 Summit. This is the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development that is getting underway next week in Rio de Janeiro. And folks, it is rather horrendous what is planned when you look at the end game here of Agenda 21. We're going to get into some more details here in just a moment. But Tom, I would like to direct people to your website because I can already see the time is going to crunch in on us here, but you've got some great reports and research, more than any other person I know, on Agenda 21. And if you would tell our listeners how they can download some of those reports.
Sure. Yeah, our website is americanpolicy.org, americanpolicy.org. And we have an archive there of probably 15, 16, 17 years of articles. We've been working on this issue since 1992, trying to sound the alarm as to what was happening and what this was all about. And a lot of people didn't hear that because they weren't affected by it immediately. Some ranchers, some farmers, some timber people, mining people out in the West were affected by it, but in the cities, people weren't getting it. And so this was kind of ignored. But in the last year and a half, it has become probably one of the top two issues that are sweeping across the country, although you wouldn't know that watching the news media. But people's concerns. And so we have the articles there. We've got special reports trying to supply everything we can so people can understand what this is about and what they can do about it.
AmericanPolicy.org is the website. You'll find many articles under the red section on their site called Breaking News, or if you click on Issues at the top, there's a full section devoted to Agenda 21. We've got so many issues here. Here's one that struck me, because I know that population control is all part of this as well that I'd like you to discuss, but Ted Turner is talking more about worldwide population control, and he was caught speaking just recently to some reporters, on-the-street reporters, reducing the world's population by 5 billion people from our current 7 billion to about 2 billion worldwide by instituting what he called a worldwide one-child policy for 100 years. Bill Gates also talks of lowering our population some 10 to 15%. How does population control fit into all this?
Population control is a major tenet of it. Actually, if Ted Turner is saying 2 billion, he's being generous compared to what some of the other ones are advocating. 1 billion is what I've heard the Earth can sustain. This is probably the most bogus issue of all. You do have areas of this world where there are teeming populations and there's utter poverty and hunger and so forth is taking place. You will find that is basically because of bad governments. Governments will not allow the people to own private property, will not allow the people to do anything that will bring them out of the dregs of poverty. They're just completely beholden to a government that's not taking care of them, and so the environment breaks down, the economy breaks down, and the populations grow. In developed nations in Europe and in the United States and others, you will find populations going down in where, the more wealth you have, the lower the population is, except for the United States population literally has only grown because of immigration, whether legal or illegal. And so, it's just people moving around. But the fact of the matter is that you could take all of the people in the world and you could put them in an area the size of Texas, and we would have the density of about Paris, France. So we don't have an overpopulation problem. We have a government problem. And so that's a bogus issue, but that's one of the big things they're pushing. And what we end up with, the programs like smart growth, which is a major tenet of sustainable development. You've probably heard of this in your communities. Smart growth is part of the local planning, how we're going to stop, get rid of gridlock on the highways, and we're going to stop urban sprawl and everything. Well, what happens is they put a wall around the community, draw a line around it basically, and they say no development can take place outside of that line. Well, what does that do? That creates an artificial limitation on the land, a shortage of land. What happens then? Housing prices go up, you have much more crowding, and population has to be controlled, and so they're artificially creating these problems, and then telling us we've got to do something about it.
There is something that I'm hoping you can unveil the darkness that's before my eyes on an issue that I'm hearing some of these men talk about. Bill Gates, for instance, he talked about lowering the population 10 to 15%. But here's what is really mystifying to me. He said, quote, "Now if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services," and then talks about how we can lower the population. Now, I get the fact about reproductive health services where they're talking about forced contraception or sterilization or, limiting one child. But things like he talks about new vaccines and health care, these things are actually things that sustain life, keep life longer. How is it that new vaccines and health care will bring down the population?
Well, it's an interesting question, and we keep asking that. And when Obamacare was being debated, and we talked about rationing of health care for the elderly, and they just all told we were just all crazy to even mention something like that. But if you begin to look at the policies, you will find that they, as they're developing the Obamacare policy, and also the other thing you can do is Google sustainable medicine. Go on the Internet and search for sustainable medicine. You will find all the tenets of Obamacare, and you will find the idea that it is a waste of resources to try to keep alive people who are no longer useful to society.
Wow.
The last person I heard say that openly was Mao Zedong.
Yeah. Hey, Tom, I'm going to turn you into an artist here. Paint for us a picture of what the world would look like, and if Agenda 21 is implemented in its fullest intent. What would this world look like? Paint that picture for us.
You would have vast amounts of land where no human beings are allowed to be there, and you would have teeming cities, massive cities on, for example, around New York. You would have Los Angeles to, down to the Mexican border there would all be one big, long mega city. And people would just be literally herded into these kinds. Chicago would be another one. There'd be a few more around the country. And that's where people would live. And they would live in high-rises where on the bottom floor would be stores, on the middle floor would be offices for businesses, and on the top floor is where you'd live. You never have to leave the building. Everything you need is right there in that building. There'd be no cars. If you traveled anywhere, it would be by bicycle. Your energy would everything that you had, that you needed in that community to live, everything would be produced in that community. There would be no imports of anything. And what this brings us right back to, not only is it a Chinese agrarian village to a certain extent, farmland would just be right outside the city, but it would go right back to the survival mode of the pioneers who grew the food they needed at the time, but in the wintertime you had to either store it or do without. And that's exactly what we're looking at here. One of the things I say when I'm speaking around the country is, do you like bananas? Well, kiss them goodbye, because, you wouldn't have an import of that coming in. You would only, if you couldn't grow them in your community, just to give you kind of a visual. And so this is what we're looking at. We're talking about shortages, we're talking about sacrifice, and we're talking about massively high prices, if you have money to buy anything with.
Address the rebranding that's going on with this. We have seen, we heard warnings from yesteryear talking about this coming ice age upon us, and then all of a sudden the conversation switched and we see this polar bear standing on an ice cube and that fast melting away. What about this rebranding that's going on? How is this being perpetrated here to the populace around the world?
Well, this is for the whole Rio Plus 20. This is key. For the last 20 years, the UN and those pushing this agenda have been using global warming, and then they changed it to climate change as the excuse that we've got to stop all that. Well, back in the beginning of 2010, they were going to have this mass meeting in Copenhagen, which this was going to be the final meeting to put all this stuff in place. Just prior to that, someone hacked into these emails of these leaders of the global warming theory and found their emails telling each other, we can't find any warming, and, well, here's a trick I used to hide it, and, lies that they were telling and so forth. Well, that resulted in what was called ClimateGate, and the Copenhagen conference that took place right after that absolutely collapsed. They had another meeting after that in Durban, and it also collapsed. There was just no political support anymore for the great hoax of climate change. So, as they're moving towards Rio Plus 20, they have decided they will not talk about climate change and global warming. Everything now will be on, they're rebranding it to sustainable development. And what I find very amusing about that is that over the last couple of years, I have been very active in building a massive movement against sustainable development in this country. It is beginning to take hold. It's getting legs. We're scoring some major victories and showing people in their own local communities why this is bad, and they're starting to throw it out. And here's the UN about to put all of its marbles into that very issue, and I couldn't be happier about it.
As you view our current administration right now in Washington, and we got this conference coming up next week, what is our official position on this? Is the U.S. going to be there in support of Agenda 21?
Oh, without question. Obama has been putting out one executive order after another. He created the White House Rural Council, which is 25 agencies literally designed to tell the people in rural areas and farms and so forth, they have to go through bureaucrats, get the approval of these 25 agencies to do anything. He now has put out another executive order, I think it was in March, what was it called, Strong Communities, Strong Cities, and this then is the city answer to the rural council. This is the city council, and so I mean this is top-down control. This is government dictating from the top what you do. This is eliminating representative government. It's eliminating your local representative governments, and it's just federal bureaucrats telling you what to do. And it's all aimed at Agenda 21. Another executive order he issued recently was to take the international development policies, building codes, and make that U.S. building codes. And, I mean, that comes straight out of the UN. This is all step-by-step implementation of Agenda 21 through the Obama administration.
So what can our listeners do, Tom?
Well, the main thing is this issue is fought on the local level. That's where it's finally implemented, and that's where we're scoring victories. And they need to talk to their city councilmen and their county commissioners and tell them these comprehensive development plans that they're implementing in there. Start questioning how does this affect my private property rights? How does this affect my job? How does it affect how the community is dealt with? And how many of these non-governmental organizations are operating in this community. I've got some things on the website, how to fight back. We've got many tools on there to learn all the details and how to fight back. We kind of go in some detail with it. The other thing that they can do is we need to call our congressmen and demand that they stand up to this barrage of executive orders and say no.
Tom DeWeese with us today. We're going to open our phone lines for you to call and make comments, ask questions of our guest. Our number to Crosstalk, 800-733-9829, 800-733-9829. When we come back, a quick story about the government, U.S. government, surveying or giving surveillance here to farmland. We'll be right back.
When it comes to the topic of origins, why shouldn't Christians accept millions of years? Couldn't God have used evolution? What about the gap theory? Could God really have created everything in 6 days? Cain's wife, who was she? Was there really a Noah's Ark and flood? Why does God's creation include death and suffering? Over 24 diverse questions are addressed in the New Answers book, Volume 1. As a matter of fact, Ken Ham, the editor of this book, said that next to the Bible, this New Answers book, Volume 1, is the most important book for people to read and understand on the topic of creation and origins. Leading apologists answer these questions biblically and logically in a simple-to-read format, including charts and diagrams. Copies of the New Answers book, Volume 1, are available from VCY for a donation of $18 or more by calling 1-800-729-9829. That's toll-free, 1-800-729-9829.
Our guest today on Crosstalk is Tom DeWeese from the American Policy Center. He is the founder and president. We're talking about the Rio Plus 20 Summit. It's the conference on sustainable development taking place in Rio de Janeiro 20 years after the original conference took place, and talking about the plan under Agenda 21. Our telephone number here, 800-733-9829. Tom, there's two stories here I'd like you to comment on, and then we'll go to the phone lines. This came from Investors Business Daily, June the 6th. Nebraska's congressional delegation sent a justifiably angry letter to Administrator Lisa Jackson last week, complaining that her EPA has exceeded its legislative and constitutional authority by conducting drone surveillance flights over Nebraska and Iowa farms looking for violations of the Clean Water Act. Here we have these military drones flying over domestic airspace and then sharing the information. They said they've got authorization for this, to share this with whatever governmental agency would be affected by it, but spying on American farmers to see if they're complying with the Clean Water Act. Is this all tied into what you're talking about?
Absolutely. The Clean Water Act is a major part of implementation Agenda 21. It's the federal government and its attempts to control all the water in the country. And this ties right in with the UN's Law of the Sea Treaty, which the UN wants to control all the seas of the world. And they, as they get into the fine points of it, they start talking about, well, the little streams and tributaries and rivers that dump into the oceans. Well, then we've got to control that too, because that comes into our oceans. So step by step, the federal government doing the Clean Water Act, and then the UN doing the Law of the Sea Treaty. So, where is the outrage in this country that a federal government is sending basically mechanical spies over your private property to determine what you're doing on it and whether you're violating something, and then moving in to shut down. The private property rights have ceased to exist in this country. All you've got the right to do is pay your mortgage and pay your taxes, and that's it. And from that on, the government will tell you exactly what to do on it, and that is all tied in. Again, this is an agenda, and that's got to be the main understanding here, is that when you're talking an agenda, you're talking about a top-down control from, in this case, from the federal government, and the states have their rights. The state constitutions, the states are supposed to be sovereign states, and the federal government should have no control like this over them, but again, they're using the military to enforce it.
Let's give you one other story, and this came out over the weekend on WND, WorldNet Daily. Lawmakers in Colorado say they want a study of groundwater issues in the northeastern part of the state, where farmers have been banned from pumping from their wells for several years. Farmers and local officials say this historic drought is an emergency. The governor should use his executive authority to bypass the judiciary. WorldNet Daily previously reported how farmers in Weld County are facing the possibility of losing their crops because courts have refused them permission to use water right under their feet, groundwater that's been rising and actually seeping into basements. 200 farmers have meeting now in a show of solidarity, signing a statement that asking they want to be able to turn their wells back on, irrigate their crops, or they're not going to pay taxes. And evidently they're concerned about depriving senior water right holders of their portion of water from the river that flows, under the groundwaters to those who hold the water rights. Is this another example?
Absolutely. Control of all the resources. The excuse they use of Agenda 21's definition is to preserve the resources of today for future generations. And they use that in this kind of an interpretation. So what future generations are there going to be once they starve out and as we talked about earlier, reducing the populations by mass? What future generations are there? They are shutting down our country, and again, this all goes to redistribution of wealth. If we can't do it here, if we can't grow the food here, if we can't have factories here, then that has to be done somewhere else. And what's happening is it's going to China, it's going to Brazil, it's going to India, it's going to other third world countries. That is redistribution of wealth. Ask anybody in this country if they know someone who's lost their jobs by the job going overseas. And then ask yourself, why did it go overseas? It's gone overseas because of one of two things. Either it is environmental regulations that literally shut the company down, or it's unions that have charged them out of existence. The two have been working hand in hand for decades, and the end result is jobs, factories, and resources are leaving. Our resources are buried, and we're having to rely on people from outside of this country. Well,
the lines are packed. We're going to begin in Alexandria, South Dakota. Larry, thank you for calling Crosstalk.
Yeah, I just wanted to say anybody that has faith or believes in the Scriptures, if they would read Genesis chapter 8, verse 22, it says, "While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease."
That's exactly right. According to God's Word, seasons are going to continue despite the mythological threats of global climate change. Thanks for bringing that forth, Larry. To Pennsylvania, John, you're on the air.
Hi. I had read an article some time ago. Well, not some time, about 2 weeks ago, actually. And what the article suggested was releasing sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere. And this person from the Carnegie Institute of Science in Stanford suggests this. And what that would do was effectively reduce the amount of sunlight that hits the Earth. And it would actually diffuse sunlight in order to combat global warming. Have you heard of this, and is this part of Agenda 21?
I'm not so specifically a part of Agenda 21, but it's certainly a part of the overall excuse for doing all this. And I heard, let's see, what was the other crazy thing that somebody wanted to do? Put a whole bunch of sailboats out in the ocean, and somehow this massive armada of sailboats was going to blow the wind in a certain direction. I've heard these things for years. They come up with this stuff. The bottom line is CO2 is not a poison to human beings. CO2 is not affecting the atmosphere. There is absolutely no evidence at this point. I can say this with absolute confidence. There is no evidence of man-made global warming causing problems. We are actually going through a cooling period right now, which is going to increase over the next few years. It's cyclical. It happens. I used to have a weatherman in my hometown who started the weather by saying, whether it's cold or whether it's hot, we'll always have weather or not. And that's exactly what this is. And, every time we have a dry season or we have strong hurricanes or we have a really hot summer or, mild winter, these idiots start this drumbeat again over global warming. See, here's what it is. And they tried to say that this year was the warmest on record. It's not. And so they'll just keep coming up with this stuff, but it's just craziness.
Thank you, John, for your call to Port Huron, Michigan. Harry, thank you for calling Crosstalk. You're on the air.
Oh, hey, fellas, and Tom, thanks for your great work.
Thank you.
And my question today is, I got one of your emails a while ago, and you mentioned as far as part of this Agenda 21 is one of the things is fighting the IRS. And my thing is, as a taxpayer, I would love to rebel and no longer pay income taxes. Is anybody doing that in this country at the moment and succeeding?
Yeah. I don't think that came from me, but because I haven't said that, I'm very wary of that. Yeah, there are some organizations doing it. Unfortunately, a gentleman who was a major leader in fighting the IRS, Tommy Cryer, is an attorney from down in Texas, and he actually beat them by saying in court, "Show me the law that says I got to pay you." And he actually won that case. I don't know all the details to it, but he was a ferocious and courageous guy, and he unfortunately just passed away. There's the organization, the what is it? The Free Enterprise Institute, I believe is their name. Is an organization that's a major leader in that effort.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
Thanks, Harry. Okay. Our number 800-733-9829. Anthony in Milwaukee, you're on the air.
Thank you for taking my call. I'd like to ask you guys, why is it that the Congress and the governors and whatever, why don't they say something? Why doesn't somebody come up and say, no, this is enough, we can't tax the American people, and where are all our representatives at crying and hollering about all of this? And I'll listen to your guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony.
Anthony, you've asked the $64,000 question, and I'll answer as briefly as I can. First of all, this whole agenda it's been coming on us for a number of years, and your local representatives, whether they're your city council, county commissioners, your mayor, your governors, all and state legislators, they all belong to national organizations. There's a National Conference of Mayors, there's a National Governors Association. When they go to these meetings, they are hearing these non-governmental organizations, these NGOs, the Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, Audubon Society, the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, the American Planning Association, all of these organizations are working, and they're at the podium. They're telling these guys, here are the policies you need to implement. Here's sample legislation. They come home from those meetings, and representatives of those same organizations, which helped write Agenda 21 at the UN level to begin with, they meet your elected representatives with the same rhetoric, with the same policies. After a while, they just begin to think, well, this is the way government's supposed to be. And along comes somebody like me saying, wait a minute, this is craziness. They say, oh, the guy's nuts. And it's just dismissed and thrown out. Bill Clinton, in 1993, put together the President's Council on Sustainable Development. The purpose of that council was to take Agenda 21 and implement it into American policy. Sitting on that council were those same NGO groups that helped write Agenda 21 in the first place, and now here they were writing American policy to implement it down. They created massive grant programs that now they go into the state legislature, get the state legislature to force your county commissioners and city councilmen to do comprehensive development plans using these grant programs, which come with these strings attached, and that's the way the cancer goes, from the UN down into your backyard. And these guys, and now say you're listening to me now, and you go into your city councilman and you say, you're implementing a UN policy. Your city councilman will look at you like you've got two heads. Mm-hmm. Like, what are you talking about? Because they're so far distanced from the UN part of it, just looking at the policy, they don't know where it came from.
I have no clue what Agenda 21 is or means. Let's go to Navarre, Florida. Rick, you're on the air.
Yes, good afternoon, gentlemen. Your guest mentioned earlier in the program the Clean Water Act that's been used to seize control of most of the water table in the country and deny farmers access to water under their feet, as you so succinctly phrased it. But the granddaddy of all enabling legislation that has allowed Agenda 21 to be implemented in recent years is the so-called Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, which the Democrats passed immediately after they took control of the Congress. And they took control of the Congress. They were in the elections of 2006. They took control of the House, you'll remember, and it was one of the first bills in the hopper when the Congress convened in January of 2007, and then they passed it as quickly as possible. And what that has done is resulted in the banning of the light bulbs and the denying of permits for coal-fired plants and so forth. So, sadly, there is enabling federal legislation at a number of different levels that is allowing these regulatory agencies to have the authority to implement these ridiculous regulations. The key is to get these ridiculous laws repealed, starting with the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. It's the granddaddy. It's the epicenter of Agenda 21.
We're going to have our guest comment on that after the break. Thank you, Rick. We'll be right back. You're listening to Crosstalk.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website is worldviewweekend.com. Today we look at number 13 on our list of 20 characteristics of false teachers. Number 13, false teachers embrace moralizing. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 20 through 22 speaks to this. For if after they have escaped the pollutions of the world, meaning moralizing. They've cleaned up their life in some man-centered way, not through faith and repentance in Christ, but they've cleaned up their life through a self-help type program, man-centered works. Then what happens? They return right to their sin, just as a sow having washed to her wallowing in the mire. In other words, these false teachers may be about trying to proclaim good works and good things, but they themselves are lost. They've cleaned up their life through man-centered efforts, not through faith and repentance in Christ. And so the end result for these false teachers is, after they're moralizing, they return to their sin. I'm Brandon House.
With us today on Crosstalk is Tom DeWeese, president of the American Policy Center. We're talking about Agenda 21, specifically the Rio Plus 20 Summit that is scheduled next week, June 20th through the 22nd in Rio de Janeiro. The caller right before the break, Tom, was telling us about this act passed several years ago that banned the light bulbs and all these other things. Let's get your comment on that. Break kind of cut our conversation short there.
Yeah, he's absolutely correct. And there are several of these enabling things. There's a Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the act he's talking about, the energy and so forth, forcing companies to cut back on their emissions from their smokestacks and all the other things that go with that. And the real stormtroopers here are the Environmental Protection Agency, which use those acts to go in and enforce their regulations. And they have become literally the stormtroopers from the Obama administration to force all this stuff in place. Now, Senator Rand Paul has introduced a bill to try to rein those in. It's Senate Bill 2122, I believe is the number to it. And its purpose is to rein in the power of the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers from doing all this and making it mandatory that no federal agent can come on private property without the written permission of the property owner. And the question we have here, and I intend to ask him this to make sure it's included, is that does that include drones flying over your property? Because that's just every bit as invasive as having a truck pull on your property and having a look around. And but there are efforts in that. In New Hampshire, there is a bill designed to do the same thing. It says that no state or local agents can come on your property without the written permission of the property owner. Now, the other alternative to that is that they've got to have some kind of a signed warrant to come on there. I mean, obviously they can't just not be allowed on the property if there's some kind of violation going on, but they've got to prove it before they come on there that there's some suspicion that that's happening, using the judicial process. But other than that, your private property is your private property, and as you see with these drones flying over there, they're just looking around for violations. They're just looking for things. And as soon as they find one, what they do, they go in and shut that land down, and nobody can use it.
And make you quite an example at the same time.
Exactly, yeah.
Let's go to the state of Oregon. Scott, thanks for holding. You're on the air.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Hello.
Go ahead, Scott.
Hello? Yes,
Scott, you're on the air. Mm-hmm.
I have a question for your guest. I would just ask if he could clarify a statement he said. He said that with the carbon dioxide buildup, or whether you believe that or not, you said that it's not a poison to the human body, but it is certainly not conducive to life.
Well, absolutely it is.
It's a byproduct of metabolism, and so if that builds up, wouldn't you think that there's some health hazards to that?
No, absolutely not. The trees give off carbon dioxide. All the plants around us give it off. The fact is some scientists have done some studies saying we've got a carbon dioxide shortage right now, and that's then causes plants to die. It causes that causes environmental damage. So no, it is not something that is. This is not carbon monoxide, which is a poison.
No, I know it's CO2. I understand that.
Sure.
Now I am a physician, and I would beg to differ. You cannot inhale carbon dioxide and live because it doesn't have any oxygen. You need oxygen. You take in oxygen and you give off CO2. And plants do the reverse. Actually, contrary to what you said, they give off oxygen, not CO2.
Well, they need the CO2 in order to
right.
To live. We all need it in order to live.
Animals expel CO2 and plants ingest CO2 and give off oxygen. So
you're correct. You're correct. Yes.
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
Great. And as a physician, I say that if you just breathe CO2, you're not going to live.
Well, yeah, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about whether it going into the atmosphere is causing. They're causing the global warming. They are using CO2 literally as a poison. Is what they've banned it, that we can't have that. We can't have it go into the atmosphere and so forth. And the fact of the matter is, as we're saying here, all the plants around us emit CO2. We all emit CO2, and there's no way you can ban it, stop it, and there's no way. The studies that I have seen that are coming out now are that it is not causing any damage in the atmosphere.
Thank you, Scott, for your call. One last call today from Pensacola, Florida. James, you're on the air.
Yes, I just want to make a comment about the income tax. I have a nephew serving 9 years in federal prison for thinking he could get away without paying taxes. And he did get away with it for several years, 10 or more. But they finally caught him in Anchorage, Alaska, and arrested him, took him back to Mississippi, where he was from, and tried him. And he is serving 108 months, and he has to serve 85% of that sentence before he could be eligible for parole. So I would be cautious telling people about not paying taxes.
I have never advocated that people shouldn't pay their taxes. I know people who are working on that, and that's what I was commenting on. But I believe that this has to be dealt with through the proper channels, and I have never, not paid. And so, in fact, the first thing I do, I don't want these guys in here. I don't want to have to deal with it. But I would never advocate people not do that.
Thank you, James. I think you misheard what our guest had said earlier. Let me quickly have you sum things up. We have about 60 seconds here, Tom.
Oh, wow. Well, again, this keep your eye on this Rio Plus 20. If they are successful in this conference, then we're going to have massive legislation coming back here. They're even working towards a world treaty to put this whole thing in place, and they've got designs on every aspect of our lives if we allow them to do this, and we've got to be alert and keep our eye on it.
Okay, again, if you would give us your website, and I know you put forth a newsletter as well, if you could give us that information.
Yeah, it's the AmericanPolicy.org is the website. Lots of information, lots of tools on there to use. My newsletter is the DeWeese Report, comes out every month, covers all these issues. I also have a book called Now Tell Me I Was Wrong, and that's also available on our website. It's about 15 years of articles I've written on these issues, give you a lot of background.
Great. And that bill from Senator Paul is Senate Bill 2122, introduced here on February 16th, the Defense of Environment and Property Act of 2012.
Right.
Tom, thanks again for being with us today here on Crosstalk.
Thank you.
And folks, thanks for joining us, keeping you informed on the vital issues. The Rio Plus 20 Summit getting underway next week in Rio de Janeiro. Thanks for joining us on Crosstalk.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. Or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.